Okay, several questions came in. I'm going to try to at first deal with questions that are more relevant to what we were doing this weekend, just to make sure we get through those. So the science-oriented type questions, since you've got me while I'm here. So we'll try to confine them first to those kind of questions that are maybe relevant to that. And if I have time, maybe I can tackle some of the other ones that came in. So you might be thinking about what questions you might have about the material this weekend. Someone asked, couldn't ducks survive the flood? Is this on here, by the way, still? We good? I'll have to reconnect. Okay, that's right. So good question about the ducks. Poor ducks. Do you kind of wish that they didn't survive? Is that what we're Okay. All right, so the question really isn't could ducks have survived outside? The question is really were they brought on the ark? That's the question. And so the terminology that's used, for example, in Genesis 6, the birds after their kind are brought, right? So if ducks would be considered the birds, then they would have been brought on board. I would suggest they would not have been able to survive. So the model that I described yesterday, it's going to obliterate anything that's above the water line and a lot of what's below it too. So it's a mess. But so as defined as a bird, they would have been on the ark. All right, did the ground raise out of the ocean? Okay, and someone else asked something explaining the means by which the seafloor raised and caused the flood. So I did talk about this yesterday, but I know it was a new concept and there was a lot of science involved, so I'll go ahead and give you kind of the Cliff Notes version again of that idea. So what we're thinking in the flood is that Genesis 7:11, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Right, so verse 11. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up. So the great deep refers to the ocean, and so this sounds like the breakup of the ocean floor. Okay, and this seems to be possibly when plate tectonics begins. Remember that the surface of the earth is broken up into big chunks, and it's unique. No other planets that we know of have the big chunks like that. And so some creation scientists think that that is what initiated the flood. And even secular scientists are starting to postulate that plate tectonics began from meteorite impacts. Whatever starts the process, the crust gets broken up into chunks. Now, when that happens, according to simulations, the plates would be moving very rapidly. Okay, so at the bottom of the ocean, you've got crust there, and it's lower than the continental crust. It's a different kind of rock, actually, which, by the way, is a problem also for conventional thinking. I'll go ahead and just chase a rabbit here. You didn't ask this question, but this is a pretty cool point. The way that conventional geologists try to explain why you have, for example, in the middle of the continent, marine creatures, okay, ocean creatures in the middle of continents. What they say is, well, that just must have been ocean floor at some point and it raised up. Now the problem with that is continental rock is totally different from oceanic rock. And the nature of continental rock is such that it floats like a cork in the mantle. So you can't get the water to go over it unless you raise the ocean floor. Okay, that's the only way you can get water to go over that. But the problem is you have to do it fast enough, because as the ocean floor is being remade by new material from the mantle coming up to the ocean, remember part of some of the pieces of the crust that are moving. Some of them are diving into the mantle. Those pieces that are moving, the other side of them, there's pieces moving apart. Those are called divergent zones, okay? And new material from the mantle comes up and makes new ocean floor there. Okay, so that is going to be higher. Though that's why we have a mid-ocean ridge. It's basically a mountain range under the ocean at those ridges. And that is one of the reasons it makes a mountain there, is because it's hotter material, so it's in an expanded state. Okay, and so then it starts moving away from there. But as it cools, it's going to shrink again. Okay, so if the continental plates are if the ocean plates are moving too slow, then the ocean floor is not going to get high enough to push water onto the land. So you got to do this fast, okay, which is what we would say happened. So the ocean floor is diving down into the mantle, new mantle materials coming up rapidly, replacing the entire ocean floor in a matter of weeks here. So all of it is hot and therefore in an expanded state, which is what causes the entire ocean floor during the flood to be at least 3,500 feet higher than it is now. So that's what would push the bulk of the water onto the land. And then you also have the geysers that are created by the magma hitting the ocean water and sending steam jets into the air. So you got water coming from the heavens, and then you got the water still rising due to the ocean floor being overturned. Hopefully that explains that. Maybe you might have needed to hear it a second time to let it sink in a little bit more.
The breaking up, where they said the land was all one and then broke away.
Okay, and so the thinking is that's Pangea, and so this is also part of yesterday in case you need to kind of go back and fill in some of that too. And I talk about this in the flooded book as well. But we think there was a continent before Pangea, okay? And that is the pre-flood continent, the day 3 continent God made. And it may have even not been one piece. It could have been different islands. We're not real sure. But whatever that configuration was, the flood begins, and it smashes together. All the pieces come together and form Pangea. Pangea is underwater the whole time. It actually never sees the light of day. It's underwater, and then it breaks apart. And so that's what secular guys, they agree with Pangea and before Pangea as well. They just say it took millions of years to happen. We would just say all this happened during the flood for the most part. So there's lots of evidence for Pangea. It's not a problem for the creationist model, maybe being alluded to in Genesis 1:9. But we would just say you got to eliminate the uniformitarian assumption that things have always been moving along slowly like they do today. The minute you consider processes that could accelerate the speed of geologic processes, it changes everything. So I'd say virtually every single old Earth dating method I've ever heard assumes uniformitarianism in some way. Ice core accumulation, lake varves, canyon erosion, radiometric dating, starlight, what else? Cave formation. All of the methods that they say, these prove an old Earth, they're all based on the assumption that whatever's going on today has always been that way. But we know that it hasn't been that way from a biblical perspective, and even they acknowledge it hasn't been that way because they have to point to catastrophic activity to explain several things in their model too. So now the question is, which catastrophic activity is true? It's really what we're arguing about, and we would say the Bible's inspired, so ours is the right one, and science supports it. So anyway. All right, let's see, I guess I'll move on to the next question. Unless somebody has another question related to that, otherwise I'll move on to another, yeah.
Just curiosity from like the secular response standpoint, when Mount St. Helens happened, was there any like shift in the narrative to say, oh, okay, well, since we saw this with Mount St. Helens, maybe we were wrong about things. Was there any?
I think that there started being a shift because now many of the secular geologists no longer say that the Grand Canyon was carved over 70 million years by the Colorado River because Mount St. Helens showed this can happen really fast. Now, none of them are accepting what we would say probably happened, of course, but they're now acknowledging other possibilities because Mount St. Helens was proof of the power of catastrophic activity. So now they basically just have to say, well, okay, but most of the Earth didn't undergo that kind of a thing. I mean, that's what they have to say. to deal with that.
Would you please explain how Mount St. Helens created this canyon effect, just like similar to the Grand Canyon?
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying it didn't take all this geologic time; it took weeks to make the canyon.
Yes.
After the Mount St. Helens eruption, there was a canyon that occurred.
That's right. There was a canyon. Okay, so first of all, by the way, in the flooded book, I've got a whole section in there that goes through a lot of the effects of Mount St. Helens that shows you the power of catastrophic activity. So Mount St. Helens was actually a relatively small eruption compared to some of the big ones that we've even had in the last 2,000 years. Like there was a massive one in Yellowstone where the debris made it all the way down to Texas. I mean, this is huge. And during the flood, there would have been thousands of these going off simultaneously. Okay, so you've got to multiply the effects of Mount St. Helens by a lot to try to understand just on the volcanic side of things, much less the erosion from tsunamis and everything else going on, but just the effects of the volcano are huge. So Mount St. Helens showed us a bunch of things that can happen really quickly. Number one, you've got when they went and back and looked at, of course, after the event happened, and it's safe to go back, they saw already layers, lamination that had been formed just from that event, layers of ash and so forth. That were already, you could see the distinct layers. At the bottom of Spirit Lake, there was already peat forming, which is how coal is formed. There were the trees from the volcano were obliterated, like blown and then washed down to Spirit Lake and formed that big log mat. And as that was observed over the following weeks and months, what they found is this is pretty cool. Those logs, first of all, as they're rubbing against each other, they knocked off all the bark. Okay, so now when you see the Spirit Lake pictures, they're like these white trees. Well, really, it's because all the bark's gone. Where's the bark? It's down at the bottom of the lake forming coal. Okay, now the trees, as a bunch of them still have the stub, right, part of the root system that it dragged with them. And so as it got waterlogged, the trees do this, and then they sink. Okay, now what's that going to look like later when people come along and see that? Because it starts getting buried down there. And then other trees later sink. They end up being a different species because the different species end up they find that they're falling out based on species. And it starts looking like forest on top of forest, which is what Yellowstone is. And they argue you got petrified forests on top of each other. This is proof of hundreds of thousands of years because this whole forest grew here. And then there had to be time for that to be covered up, and then a whole other forest had to grow. And so they say these successive forests, no, this actually can be multiple eruptions happening, causing these events to happen. And interestingly, to support that, when they study the tree rings and the different levels of trees, they match each other, which tells you they're from the same forest, and they'll even find the root systems from where they came from way away. And they got tore up, brought over there and buried, and now we know how. Mount St. Helens is showing us how it happened. But yeah, one of the other effects is canyons erode. I mean, a single mudslide after the main eruption carved these thick, like they call it the Little Grand Canyon. It's like a 1/40th scale model of the Grand Canyon. Was carved in a day. So when you look over at Grand Canyon, it also is the power of erosion, and the bulk of the Christian geologists would argue that the material there, the layers that you'll see, were deposited in the flood, but the erosion came during the Ice Age. Okay, so during the flood, this section of land gets lifted up. It's called the Colorado Plateau, and it's like a saucer. Okay, makes a saucer shape. And so there ended up being, as the glaciers were retreating, it left these massive lakes on the Colorado Plateau. And you got to keep them, I mean, these are like the Great Lake kind of size. These are huge. Okay, so the Grand Canyon is tiny compared to these lakes. The Grand Canyon is big, but compared to these lakes, they're huge. Like last year, I flew into Phoenix, drove up on the Colorado Plateau, and just kept driving north across all these plates, these lakes. and then went off the plateau and went to Salt Lake City to fly out. And you can see the river, like you can see the edges of these ancient lakes as you're going. And this is huge. I mean, but you go to the Grand Canyon and it's small compared to these lakes. And the thinking is that these lakes breached and very rapidly carved the Colorado River. So there is no rapidly carved the Grand Canyon. There is no secular model that I know of that can make sense of this. I mean, it's so funny. In fact, I guess it was last week, I was there at the Museum of North Arizona, and of course, they're going to talk a lot about the Grand Canyon. It's right there. And I was looking at their explanations, and like one of them was saying, well, water used to be going, into the plateau, and then it changed, and that's what carved it. And I'm like, wait a minute. The center of the plateau is in higher elevation, and the river was going, okay, how does that work exactly, right? That doesn't work, okay? Gravity doesn't allow that to happen, okay? You need to have the water on the plateau, and it goes that way. Anyway, so did I answer all that? Hope I did. Nope, he's got another question. All right.
Just the size of the Colorado River, because I have hiked down the Grand Canyon area, and the size of that, I mean, although it's a big river, I mean, the Grand Canyon is
It's tiny compared to the Grand Canyon. Yep.
Right, and so
Yep.
I just honestly can't fathom, even if I imagine about it, how a river that width could carve something
Yes.
this long.
So here's the thing. Here's the problem. You're using your common sense. That's a problem. In secular geology, you're not allowed to do that. So, no, I mean, you're right. I mean, I was standing on the rim, 2 weeks ago, and you can hardly see the Colorado River. It's like I'm trying to point to all the students that are with me, like, can you see down there? It's like a little tiny, and they're like, what? What are you talking about? Yeah, and you're sitting there looking at this vast, thing, and it's just one little, you're telling me that carved this? I mean, no wonder they want to say uniformitarianism would make it take so long. I mean, because it's such a tiny river. But, you can make predictions. Okay, if that's true, 70 million years, the Colorado River was doing that. Okay, all of the material of the Grand Canyon should have been carried somewhere. Okay, well, you can go to the delta at the end, and it's not there. And in fact, we can calculate how much material there should be if uniformitarianism is true. And it's multiple times the entire volume of the whole Grand Canyon should be deposited in the Gulf of California. It's not there. It tells you that uniformitarianism cannot explain that. You got to have some kind of catastrophic process to explain it. It should be what? Oh yeah, well that's another issue. Why do we not see Grand Canyons forming everywhere? And you can agree you have to have the right kind of sediment and so forth to do what's going on out there, but yeah, and you got to have a lot of time from their perspective to do it. But what I would say is not only will that not do it, that's not what has to do it, and it's clearly not what did do it. Okay. Someone asked, yeah.
Well, just a follow-up question. So, where did all that material go? Obviously, it was very rapid. So, was it just dispersed a lot further out?
So, a lot of the material, yeah. So, we're not saying that the material from the Grand Canyon wouldn't be at the end of the Colorado River, but the amount that should be there, if they're right, is multiple times the volume of the sediment of the entire Grand Canyon should be there. If it's been doing it over 70 million years, because it's like 168 million tons of sediment that are being pulled out of the Grand Canyon every year by the Colorado River. So you multiply that times 70 million years, that's a lot of material, way more than the material that is even at Grand Canyon. It should be there and it's not. But yeah, it's true that a lot of that sediment would not necessarily be in the delta from our perspective. It's going to be spread out, but the bulk of it would have been carried to that delta at the end, I would think. Yeah. Someone asked, what is carbon-14? So keep in mind that there's different kinds of dating methods. If somebody tells you carbon dating proves that the Earth is millions of years old, that person does not understand dating methods. It tells you immediately they're ignorant, because anybody that knows carbon-14 dating knows carbon dating cannot be used to prove an old Earth. You use radiometric dating to try to do that. like uranium, lead, and rubidium, strontium, other methods, potassium, argon. Carbon dating is used for things that used to be alive, like organic things. So when you die, you've got a certain amount of carbon-14, and it immediately starts decaying into nitrogen-14, okay? And it has a half-life. I think it's like 5,730 years, which what that means is half of the amount of carbon-14 you had in your body decays into nitrogen-14 in that half-life, whatever it is, 5,730 years. So if you look at, say, a bone, and it has half carbon-14, half nitrogen-14, they would assume that bone is 5,730 years old. If it has a quarter of the original carbon-14 and now 3/4 nitrogen-14, it's now gone through 2 half-lives. It's now roughly 11,000 years old, right? So that's what a half-life is. So you take the full amount. After the half-life, it now has half. After another half-life, it now has a quarter. After another half-life, it has an eighth. And you're doing that. Now, after we get to a certain point, we don't have the technology to detect carbon-14 anymore. And that's at about 50,000 years. All right, so what that means is if you detect carbon-14 in a bone, it's not even 50,000 years old. That's what that means. So there's no way to use carbon dating to prove an old Earth, okay? And keep in mind, that's assuming that the rate of decay of carbon-14 into nitrogen-14 has been constant, which we would say it hasn't been. During the flood, something caused the acceleration of all nuclear decay, not even just on the Earth, but solar system wide, because we see the same thing in asteroids passing by. Okay, so anyway, maybe that answers that question. Someone asked, what is petrification? Petrification is where you're taking something that was alive and turning it to stone, turning it to rock. And you do that, so if you see a petrified object, say a bone or a tree, it is not the original material anymore. It's no longer a bone or tree or anything. It has been totally replaced with minerals, and it's been turned totally in. It's not even that it was turned into a rock. It was replaced by materials that then hardened and became rock. So you picture a creature gets totally buried under the ground, and he's kept away from anything that will accelerate its decay. Okay, so it's sitting down there, away from microorganisms and so forth. And gradually, the softer parts are going to tend to decay faster. That's why you don't usually see any of that stuff survive. And if you do, it's called a mummified creature, which is a very rare thing. That's where you actually get to see what the exterior looked like. That part gets fossilized. Like, for example, in Canada, a few years ago, there was a nodosaur, which is a kind of an ankylosaur, those big like tank dinosaurs that have like a tail that looks like a club. It was mummified. So yeah, we actually got to see what the exterior looked like, not just the bones. But usually all that decays too quickly to be replaced by new material. So usually it's just the harder stuff that survives. You got this harder stuff, and it's gradually being eroded away or dissolved by water coming through there, and it gets carried away. It leaves a little hole. The minerals from the water coming in then replace that little hole, and it keeps doing that. That's what eventually turns it into a rock. And so it's no longer at all the original bone. It's been replaced by other material coming in there, and it's just kept the shape of it. That's basically what a fossil is. Maybe more than you wanted to know, but there you go. Somebody asked what happened to the dinosaurs. So we talk about dinosaurs, and I mentioned to you that we have a lot of evidence that the dinosaurs existed in the not too distant past. The one point that I brought up was that we now are finding soft tissue in dinosaur fossils all over the place that should have been totally decayed if they're 65 to 250 million years old. It takes a blind faith to think that could still be around. There is no known mechanism that could preserve soft tissue that long. We got nothing. And so that is proof positive that the dinosaurs were around in the not too distant past. So that's the fossil evidence, but you also have historical evidence of the dinosaurs in the recent past by the legends that have been passed down. And now, of course, they didn't use the term dinosaur because that wasn't coined until the 1840s. So instead, you have to look at the description of these creatures, these large reptilian creatures, some of which have, two big hind legs and small, short front legs. And some of them are described as having wings and yet still being reptilian-like. All of these are description of dinosaurs. I mean, the description, even the drawings you'll find, look very much like dinosaurs. Now, they use the term dragon, right? And so it's legend, right? Because a lot of these stories go so far back. But this is what you would expect to find if humans saw these things and interacted with them. And we even have respected historians like Marco Polo and Josephus that made descriptions of creatures they encountered in their travels that, again, matches these kind of species. Then you've got physical evidence, not just historical, where humans were making carvings, drawings, artifacts that, again, are anatomically correct dinosaurs. Like, for example, in Cambodia, this stegosaur, it looks clearly like a stegosaur. Let me see if I got a picture on our website. See here. Okay, so what in the world does that look like to you? Okay, I mean, they're having to do some gymnastics to try to explain this away. And see, the problem is when we find dinosaurs, we don't find them usually in any kind of articulated form where even their skeletons are in a form where we can tell what it looked like. Instead, we find shards, bits and pieces, and yet every time you find these drawings, carvings, and so forth that are pretty old, they've got all the flesh on them, and they look anatomically correct. And these are not professional paleontologists that can communicate with the rest of the world and try to get the anatomy correct. See, we're at a point now where, because of our ability to communicate, I can find a part of a dinosaur here, and somebody else over there in another country finds one, and it happens to be, this is clearly the same guy, but now we know what this part looks like, so we can start putting it together. Okay, they don't have that. Okay, they don't have that ability. And yet they're drawing anatomically correct creatures, sauropod dinosaurs, some of which even have the dermal frills on them that we only discovered some of them had in just the last 20, 30 years. This one's especially interesting because stegosaur, when we discovered its existence in the 1800s, the plates that are on the back of stegosaur are not attached to the spine. And so the plates are found just out beside it. They're just out there. We still don't know exactly how the configuration on the back, because they're not attached. And so originally, they just thought, well, maybe these are like shingles. And they would put them on the stegosaur like shingles. And that's why his name is roof lizard. That's what his name means. And then they figured out, oh, wait a minute, they're supposed to stand up. Okay, now here we've got people from 1,000 years ago drawing this that are correct anatomically. Okay. Anyway, so that would be examples of physical evidence. Then, of course, you've got what I would say is biblical evidence. When you look at what is going on there in Job, we could spend a whole session on this, but you look. So remember the flow here in Job. God is humbling Job because Job's had this attitude like, look, all this bad stuff's happened to me, and this isn't fair. I need an explanation. You need to explain yourself, God. And God's like, oh, really? Let me just show you some things that'll kind of put you in your place. And he moves from thing to thing to thing, basically saying, okay, Job, do you know this very simple thing about the universe? And he keeps moving through things that at one point, Job even has to say, look at this. Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. I'm bad. My bad. I'm sorry. And God's like, hey, I'm not done yet. He says, prepare yourself like a man, which, by the way, means there's such a thing as being a man to God, by the way. God, there's something that goes with that, what a man should be. And God basically says, get out of the fetal position, let's roll here. I got something to say to you, I'm not done. Who are you? You going to annul my judgment? Would you condemn me so that you can be justified? Okay, and then he goes, let me just get down to the two crowning examples of the kingdom that I've created. Look now at Behemoth. Okay, and he goes through and gives this description of Behemoth, keeping in mind that he's highlighting things that are notable about these creatures that make them kind of special. Like, for example, his strength being in his hips, which doesn't fit the hippo or the elephant, which is what a lot of commentators want to say this is. It doesn't fit. The elephant's strength is actually in its forelegs. And the sauropods, the big dinosaurs with the long tail, long neck, theirs is backwards. There's been studies on that recently. His bones are like beams of bronze. And by the way, again, that doesn't fit with the hippo and the elephant because they actually have spongy marrow in the cavities of their bones. A big portion of the inside of their bones is empty. Whereas the sauropod dinosaurs are unique because their ribs and their leg bones were solid bone. So it's actually notable. They're so huge, they had to be designed a little bit different. And then he says, this guy is the first. In other words, the chief of the ways of God. You want to know what God is like? You look at this dude. Okay. And keep in mind that there's lots of evidence that this is immediately after the flood, and we know the dinosaurs were on the ark. Okay, because they're alive when the flood hits, which means they're on the ark, so they're definitely going to be around at this time. Why in the world would you not select a sauropod dinosaur at the time? His bones are like beams, his ribs like iron. He is chief. Only he who made him can bring near his sword, right? So you picture a sauropod dinosaur whose thigh bone is taller than me, just the thigh bone, okay? And so even if you have a sword, what are you going to go try to hack at one of his toes or something? I mean, what are you going to be able to do with that? What is that going to matter? The mountains yield food for him. That doesn't fit with hippos. Hippos have got to stay in the water to stay cool. They're not going off into the mountains. He lies under the lotus trees in the covert of reeds and marsh. They cover him. And of course, the big one that I skipped over, he moves his tail like a cedar. Okay, now cedar trees are throughout the Bible and notable for their size and their strength. And I can't think of a creature where you would compare its tail to being a tree. Definitely not a hippo, whose tail is like a little sprig. Oh, this is God saying, hey guys, Job, I want you to look at this tail right here. This is as strong as I am. I mean, really, I don't think so. I don't think that's what you do. But if you look at a sauropod dinosaur's tail, it is as big as a tree, and I can't think of anything else that would be. Okay, so it fits. So I'd say that's biblical evidence of the dinosaurs. So we got plenty of evidence that they've been around in the last few thousand years. Yeah.
It's an ignorant question, or maybe I missed it, but so what happened?
Oh yeah, so that was the ultimate question. What happened to the dinosaurs? All right, so we can only speculate. Number one, I would say the dinosaurs are found so the flood buries creatures by habitat, okay? And the dinosaur habitat is predominantly gymnosperm trees, not angiosperm. So today, the dominant plant is angiosperm. It's the fruit trees, the flowering trees. The gymnosperm trees, which is like what you find out west, we don't have those anymore. But in the dinosaur habitat, they're very prominent. They're the tree, which tells me any of the herbivores, for example, are eating those kind of plants, and yet they're not dominant today. So that's one issue, is they probably didn't have the vegetation they needed. Number two, I would expect that the ice age is going to be a problem for them, okay? So unless they camp out somewhere, as reptiles, unless they're going to camp out somewhere close to the equator, it's going to be a problem. And some of them it clearly did. And that's why a lot of the tales, the legends that have been passed down, involve interactions in places that where they would have been able to survive for longer. So it's interesting to me that you're going to get a lot more than maybe you asked here. But this is cool. So where the flood ends in the geologic column, we think is the KT boundary. It's the line above which there are no more dinosaur fossils. Okay, they stop there. So right after that, the flood's over, animals very quickly disperse across the planet. Okay? Why? Because God told them to, and animals are going to obey. So they disperse. But guess who doesn't? The humans. So you don't see any human fossils there until you get up to the Pleistocene, and then all of a sudden the humans disperse very rapidly from the Middle East. So the humans are still there in the Middle East for a period of time, and so the only place you would see fossils of humans is if there happened to be catastrophic activity at Babel. Otherwise, you're not going to see fossils until they start spreading out, and then sure enough, you see Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis start popping up all over the place. They're just humans. These are just humans, different varieties of humans. But it seems that the oldest dragon legends are from around there in the Middle East, but then the ones that got away from that area survive longer because the humans don't get to where they're at. And that's when they start interacting. And I think that that may be what is going on in, you see this passing reference after the flood. Look at verse 8. Cush begot Nimrod. What a name, right? And he began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And, you know, I'm thinking as a kid, oh, well, he's like this safari guy. He's taking out lions or something. Well, the kind of game that he's dealing with, I mean, dinosaurs would make you a pretty mighty hunter. And I'm thinking that's a great source of meat, maybe, for my entire village. If I can take that out, and everybody's going to really think I'm a boss if I can take that guy out. And so I'm going to become great, which is what Nimrod, of course, wants to do. So what is he taking out that makes him so great? Well, I wonder. So I figure hunting would be a big reason why they died out. So I figure it's several things that were involved in that. And keep in mind that after the flood, there's not nearly the catastrophic conditions that would be needed to fossilize dinosaurs. We don't have a lot of fossilization going on today because you need very catastrophic conditions, which is perfect in the flood, but after the flood, that's going to be harder to recreate. Somebody asked, is there in existence any full skeleton of a dinosaur? And the answer is yeah. I mean, that's whenever you find an articulated skeleton, that's where you've got it all, and it's even in the position that it was in life, and that's rare. It's rare to find that. Usually you find just parts of it. And so then you have to find a skeleton somewhere else to figure out what maybe the rest look like. Keeping in mind that God made creatures generally to be symmetrical. Okay, so if you find half the body and it happens to be the right side, well, hey, you know what the left side looks like, right? Usually. Yeah, so woolly mammoths are a lot easier because those are post-flood. They're all in post-flood sediment we call Cenozoic. They're in the Pleistocene, which is where the humans show up. And so, yeah, you can find those even with hair and stuff. We think those are part of the elephant kind. It may have been more like what stepped off the ark, the mammoths. And from them came your Asian and Indian elephants, and your mastodons are also part of that group too. Okay. Yes, sir.
Isn't that suspected to be their demise, overhunting?
You know, I would think so. I don't know what kind of the latest theory on that is, but I would expect that that'd be a big one, a big reason for it. Oh, sure, yeah. And their hides, you know, they're very hairy. Good clothing. Any other questions about any of that? We keep moving. I don't know how much time it's been, David. I've totally lost track. Keep going. All right. Somebody said, who were the Nephilim? Whew. Okay, so I've got a section in the Flooded book on the giants. And in fact, there's an endnote where I go more into that. Kids probably wouldn't care as much about the technical side of that, so I put it in an endnote where I look at the other words that are used in the Bible besides Nephilim to describe these giant humans. And so the descriptions that are given in the text seem to imply these are giants of some sort, just giant humans. Now, you know, this isn't like people that are 9 stories tall, kind of, those sort of fictional stories. But here, for example, New King James uses that term giants, and really we're talking about Nephilim is the underlying word there, mighty ones. And so they're before the flood, and also, okay, so there were giants on the earth in those days before the flood, and also, or not just before the flood, I would suggest this is saying at a time before the sons of God came into the daughters of men. So there were giants, and then also the sons of God went into the daughters of men and bore children to them, and that also formed these giants. Okay, so the giants are already around before this happens. This is one of the reasons people try to say, well, this has got to be the angels here. And I'd say, I don't think that's what the grammar's saying here. I think this is saying the giants are around, and they also are around when the sons of God went into the daughters of men. So I feel strongly that the context here limits this as to what we understand this to be referring to. And I've got, see, God put in the genome the potential for a huge amount of variety. I mean, we just look around today and see it. That all of this, even just that's in this room, came from 2 people. It's huge. But also, in the past, there was even more variety. And, whenever, have you ever noticed that, I'm going to pull up a picture here for you. Find this. Okay. So take a look at these pictures. So this guy on the left here is my adopted brother, Chris. He's half black, half white, and he married a girl who is half Korean, half Asian, and half white. And look at what their kids look like. You see the variety there? I mean, she's basically Hawaiian looking. She looks kind of Polynesian. She kind of looks Indian. We have white, closer to maybe black, although he's got some what you'd think of as typically black features. So their kids are an example of what happens when you take genomes that are generally don't mix, and you mix them back together, and you see an enormous amount of variety really fast. And so what happened after the flood, after Babel, you have these 3 lineages that go separate directions, and so they no longer intermingle. So you lose a big chunk of the potential genetic diversity. And each of those groups only starts breeding with each other, and so certain traits would become dominant. And that can even cause certain, if God put the potential for huge size and tiny size in the genome, then if those people tend to get together and sequester off and you don't add back in any other genetic information, then those will become dominant. I think that's why Homo heidelbergensis becomes dominant, which I showed you yesterday, is because, we even in our own country, whenever you think of the slave trading that was going on, some of those slave traders were realizing, look, I want bigger, stronger slaves. So what did they do? They started doing intentional breeding with the slaves to make sure that they got bigger, stronger people. So this is not complicated to figure out. And so I would think that in a world, for example, before the flood, that is extremely violent, that's one of the big reasons God calls an end to it. That is one of the things that's probably going on, is people are breeding, they're trying to hone their clan's strength so that in military pursuits, they can be the greatest. And so from that would naturally come massive people if you start doing that. But on the other hand, you can have tiny people. So we have a group of humans after the flood that go off to the island of Flores and start populating, and they're tiny. They're tiny people. We've got their skeletons and everything. These tiny people, little dwarfs. They even call them hobbit man. So they call them. They're just humans, but they're tiny. Those genes are what got so sequestered for so long that they kind of lost the potential for any other thing until somebody else from another area comes and starts breeding, and then you'd see an explosion again of a lot of genetic potential. What's your question?
Does the Bible ever say what color Adam and Eve's skin are or how tall they were?
No, it doesn't come out and say, but we can kind of hypothesize. If, for example, so first of all, we know that everybody came from Adam and Eve. So there's really just one race. So racism is stupid, really. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Genetically, it doesn't make any sense. God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, you know. Although, ironically, guess who developed a model that was extremely racist? You know what the actual title of Charles Darwin's book was? All you hear is The Origin of Species. They don't like to highlight the second half of the title. Origin of Species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Darwin was a big racist. He was assuming that Caucasians were the most evolved of the races, and the rest were going to eventually be eliminated through natural selection because they're not as good as the Caucasians. That was Darwin. That was Darwin's thinking. And that's evolutionary thinking. Hitler picked it up and used it too. And I like to talk about that, but the bottom line. But anyway, so racism is pure silliness, but that's not what you're asking about. So we've got these different groups that I would say really the reason they exist, again, is because they were sequestered from each other genetically for so long that certain traits started becoming dominant. Now, so how do you get all these differences? Well, first of all, just take one characteristic. Okay, melanin is the pigment that we have that controls the color of your skin, your hair, your eye color, and there's similar kinds of genetic genes that will control other features, like whether you have what is this called, a widow's peak or whatever, and whether you have a cleft, the dent in your chin, that kind of thing. Even whether you have a prominent chin or not, or whether your eyebrow, your brow kind of goes out a little further. Okay, so if you have, so this melanin is controlled by genes, okay? And we're going to very much simplify this, but you can have different varieties of genes here. And depending upon what that variety is, you can, when you combine them, get different varieties, for example, of skin color. So if Adam and Eve were what we call heterozygous, okay? So they have both dominant and recessive genes. Their children could have been all of these potential skin colors. In one generation, they would have had that. Now, if you only take people that are, let's say, dominant, and they just start breeding, you only get these. If you get people that are only recessive, then you only get really light colors. But if you have two people that are mixed in that way, dominant and recessive, you can get all of this in one generation, all that variety. So then and again, you got to multiply this times all the genes. Now, if you then sequester just some of those, you'll eliminate a lot of the other potential is what ends up happening. And that's why certain features will then start becoming more dominant. So after separating at Babel and mating within the same gene pools, over time certain colors would gain dominance in those areas. And again, then you have cool things happen whenever you mix that up. And by the way, so the humankind then, this is all considered humankind by creationists. And this is a lot of variety. There's those tiny ones, Homo floresiensis. You've probably heard of erectus. This is Homo sapiens. That's kind of the dominant variety today. Heidelbergensis, this is the big boys. Neanderthal man. Here's Homo naledi, which is a new one that's been discovered relatively recently. And so this is just other varieties of humans that have been found, is what we think they are. Right.
it says that right at the beginning, when after Cain killed Abel, when it says that he went out and found a wife, where did that wife come from?
Good question. That is a lot of times an argument people use against the Bible. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the text there. Okay, so the question is, if Cain went out and found a wife, where did he get the wife from? Right? Because all you have is Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel. So, and more than that, not just where did he get his wife, but who's he afraid of? Okay, so let's think through it. By the way, we've got articles that deal with these things more in depth on our website. I don't want to forget that. Let's go ahead and look at the text here. Adam knew his wife Eve. She conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother, Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, how long is that? We don't know. It came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground. Now, you might have in your mind, in your mind, how old is Cain? Maybe he's 30. How do you know? How many other children have now Adam and Eve had? The Bible didn't say. It came to pass, Cain brought an offering. Abel also brought the firstborn of his fruit and their fat. The Lord respected Abel. He didn't respect Cain's. Cain's upset. So God says to Cain, why are you angry? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin lies at the door. As dire is for you. You should, by the way, you can and should rule over sin. All right, so Cain talked with Abel, his brother. When? It came to pass. When did that, how much time passed there? I don't know. Okay, so you get the idea here. You get the point. You tend to think, oh, well, he had that talk with God and he's upset, so the next day he goes and talks with Abel. Well, it doesn't say that. The text doesn't say that. So it came to pass, when they're in the field, Cain rose up against Abel and killed him. Then God said, where's Abel, your brother? He said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? By the way, there's the first smart aleck in the Bible. And he said, what have you done? Your voice, your brother's blood cries out. Now you're cursed. Cain said, oh, my punishment, it's pretty stiff. All right, so then, now he's like, anybody who finds me is going to kill me. Okay, so who's he worried about? Well, is it possible that he's 100 years old? Now keep in mind, he's got to be old enough to now be able to be a tender, to be a farmer, right, and so forth. He's got to be old enough to have a career. But you don't know how old he is. He could be 100 years old here. Do you know people that are 100 years old? How many offspring do they have in their distant family? Who is it that's, 52 and counting, whatever that show is? 27, 30, 200 people and counting. You know what I'm talking about, the show? Yeah. You don't have, it was all about that family that has a ton of kids, and it was a reality show. Anyway, I can't believe you haven't heard of that. Anyway, they got a ton of kids in a short amount of time, and keep in mind that they're supposed to be being fruitful and multiplying and fill the earth. That's the mandate. So they're not waiting to have kids. They're pumping them out, and they could have even had twins, and so I don't know. And so it's possible that there are many people that Cain would have been concerned about. And who would he have married? Well, the obvious answer is either a sister or a niece, or even a cousin at this point. And you say, oh man, that's incest, that's disgusting. Well, keep in mind, this is long before the law of Moses. Okay, this is 2,500 years before the law of Moses. Okay, and so by the time of the law of Moses, if you now intermarry and breed with somebody in your own family, that can mess up your gene line really bad, because you now start doubling the chance of the bad things that in your genes. Now you have a much bigger chance of that proliferating in your children. But at this point, the genome is pristine. They don't have to worry about that. And so the question about who to be with was not an issue. But starting at the law of Moses, God has to say, okay, now you're not going to be allowed to intermarry with your closer family because of that genetic issue. All right. A good question.
You talked about the Ice Age being the result of the flood.
Yeah.
That made a lot of sense. But I was wondering, Like, it seems like when I was in school, it was meteor hit the Earth, it wiped out the dinosaurs, the planet turned into an ice ball.
Yeah.
And then what you explained yesterday kind of makes sense. Well, it did make sense with the flood having caused that atmosphere to cause the ice age.
Mm-hmm.
How would both the evolutionists and creationists explain how life survived the ice age?
Yes, okay, so the secular guys, I don't know what they would have to say. Why does a meteorite hitting the Earth 65 million years ago mean that just the dinosaurs die out, but not anything, not much else? Really, 75% of the species on the planet are thought to have died. But the dinosaurs are kind of the bulk of them, and it doesn't kill a bunch of other stuff. And I don't know how you explain that. I think that's a problem. And that's why that's not necessarily the consensus view even. And in fact, there's debate over whether or not that is a meteorite crater that they're even referring to that's there. It's off the coast of Mexico, the Chicxulub crater. And creationists have even been studying that to figure out, is that even a meteorite crater? But assuming it is, what we would say is that's just part of the other meteorite activity going on in the flood, of course. And so there's a ton of meteorites then putting all kinds of volcanic aerosols in the air from the flood perspective. It's way more spread out from a secular perspective, and yet somehow that's still catastrophic enough to kill off 75% of the species on the planet. You know, it makes you scratch your head a little bit. What creationists, I guess, would say is that the volcanic aerosols are going to cause it to be darker still. But they're not necessarily going to be, you're not going to be necessarily at that point dealing with all of the ash the whole time, like breathing in and being killed by that. But it is going to make it where there's going to be more snowfall and precipitation from the increased evaporation from the oceans. And that water, the rain and the snow is going to pull a lot of the volcanic aerosols out of the air too. That's actually going to be working at the same time. You got some volcanic aerosols maybe higher in the atmosphere that are going to shield the Earth better from the sun, but maybe the heavier aerosol particles, which would maybe be more of a problem for us, a lot of those may be kind of rinsed out of the atmosphere by the rain. I don't know, I haven't dug that deep in, just kind of thinking through that logic. All right, what else we got? There's some other questions here that are not necessarily as directly related to this weekend. I was surprised nobody asked why, I don't know if I need to ask myself this question. Why do you not see humans in the flood layers? Why do they not show up until after the flood in the Pleistocene? I'm just asking myself that. Anybody else want to ask me that? Anybody? Are y'all curious about that? I think that's one of the cool questions. So theologically, it makes sense that you don't want to be able to study the pre-flood humans theologically. Why is that? Well, because they're really bad. Like, the Bible does not come out and tell you everything they're even doing, and I think there's a reason for that. Remember, it's gotten to a point where they're only ever intending to do bad things. Like, everything they're doing, that's pretty bad. So you don't want archaeologists and paleontologists to be able to dig down and study those layers. So how do you totally destroy the human habitat and leave not even fossils behind? How are you going to do that? Well, one easy way is you have the pre-flood world seems to be broken up by habitat. It's different than what we are today. So today everything's kind of mixed for the most part. You do have some places where you tend to have a certain kind of animal, and so there is still some division, but for the most part we're pretty mixed. But the pre-flood world, based on the fossil record, it seems to be very sequestered by habitat, where you don't see a mixture in the layers. Like when you see the dinosaur rock layers, there's some birds, but pretty much most of the birds are not there, and the mammals, the larger mammals, are not there. And so it's kind of, they're their own thing, as though they're kind of this sequestered place, an island or something that gets buried later in the flood or something. And the humans and the larger mammals, and we all tend to stick together with the larger mammals, and the angiosperm trees, like the angiosperm plants, that's all. It's not just the humans. All of that is missing from the flood layers. It's really a whole habitat is missing. You're going through all these habitats, and should be the humans, the larger mammals, and the angiosperms, they're gone. They're obliterated. So if you're going to take out the humans, you've got to take out everything that's with them too. Okay, all their fossils. Okay, and the way to do that is if the habitat is on a subduction zone. That's the way you do that. So, and so by the way, this is like Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, kind of what we're talking about here. Okay, so remember a subduction zone. Remember the plates of the earth are moving around, and some of them are sliding past each other, like at the San Andreas Fault. That's transformation. Some are moving apart. That's divergence. We see that in New Mexico. Some are smashing into each other, forming mountains. And then if you have an ocean plate and a continental plate, that's subduction happens, okay? Where stuff there gets pulled down into the earth, in the mantle. And remember that we have, once we got the technology to be able to look under the subduction zones, under the crust, we find huge amounts of cold material that hasn't yet melted and recycled into the mantle, and that very well could be the pre-flood human habitats that are down there melting in the mantle. So that would be the easiest way to do that. But it's kind of scary to think about. I mean, that may have been the first thing to happen in the flood. If they happen to be at a subduction zone, they would go down right away, and the rest of the planet has got weeks and weeks to deal with what's coming. So that really would actually be gracious of God for them to not have to go through everything else that's fixing to happen. Yeah. Did you also have your,
That because you can see, like, when they found, like, a completely preserved girl, 15-year-old girl who was a human sacrifice down in an Incan area, that, like, it's interesting to watch how the scientific community reacts to, like, these horrible things. This is fascinating. And it would make sense that God would not want any of what they had going on to be preserved, because even today you can see evidence of horrific things from thousands of years, and they're like, oh wow, that's really interesting that they did that.
Inevitably, people that hear that will then try it out. I mean, that's inevitable. That's the way it always goes down. So it's just interesting to me how tight-lipped God is about it. He doesn't even want us to know. He even tells you about Sodom and Gomorrah, but he doesn't tell you about the pre-flood world. And that's pretty bad. Remember, like I said, that the terminology there for him to say, Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great. Okay, that's an indicator there. Every intent, right, or does have anything else? Every thought of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, right? All the day, right, is the actual translation there. Imagine how bad that would be. So I like the ESV rendering of that. Translation's open, you can't even see. Oh, wrong way. Every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. Yeah, I think this one's the ESV over here. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Well, that's a creepy thought. Right? So again, the idea is he only ever intended evil. That was his intention. If anything good happened, he didn't mean for it to. That's bad. Huh? Right. Accidental acts of kindness. Yeah, I mean, there would be some of that. Imagine living in that. Imagine having to be Noah, living in that. Yes, ma'am.
To so much evil.
Okay, well, now you're back to, he tells you there in verses 1 and 2, and this is one of the reasons it's important to make sure we understand what this is saying. Sons of God, now this can mean angels or it can mean the righteous people in the Bible. And so you have to look at the context to see who it's talking about. I argue this is the righteous people in the context, starting at the end of chapter 4, moving up to here. That helps to define who this is. The righteous people started marrying the carnal people due to beauty. Okay, do we see that going on? You know, this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, Dating Without Detonating, because I see this. I mean, young people are dating people they shouldn't be dating, and so of course they get corrupted, and it destroys their spiritual life. I see it over and over and over. I mean, Paul said, 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil company corrupts good habits, and he starts it out with, do not be deceived. Why would he say that? Well, because we tend to be deceived on this. We tend to, well, you know, yeah, I mean, it'll corrupt some losers, but not me, because I'm like the spiritual boss. No, don't be deceived. You're going to have your habits corrupted if you marry people you shouldn't, or if you mingle with people in that close kind of way. So it's a passionate topic to me, because he's telling you that's what caused this. That's what caused the decline. If the righteous people start doing that, it destroys the righteous. They get taken out. And so the devil has got to be sitting there going, because he's known what to do all along. It works every time. And so he's done it in our country. It's a big problem in our country.
I like what you said about holy means alone, or they didn't say it exactly like that.
Yeah, when push comes to shove, that's ultimately what it's going to mean. Is our young people need to know that what it's going to mean to be holy means to be lonely, basically. You're going to be alone. Just get used to it. Be okay with it. You don't have to have some best friend while you're here on the planet. That's right, because you still got God, and you got the church, if you're plugging in.
So, we talked before about anxiety and not worrying about what you eat or what you wear because we're higher than the animals and they don't worry. Am I saying that right? Okay. So what about when somebody comes and says to you, well, what about people that are genuinely starving, that are worried about where their food is going to come from and it's not being supplied? How do you answer that?
So those are the people that we've got to convert, right? Because,
I need the answer too.
Yeah. Well, so within the Christian system, if we're doing the right thing, okay, then you're not, God in some way is going to make sure that you're going to be provided for in the necessities of life. That is not guaranteed to non-Christians. All right, so that's the first issue.
Country that are isolated Christians because they'll get in trouble.
Well, again, I would say you're not going to have a situation where they're not going to be able to survive, based on Matthew 6. That can't happen. The providence of God is going to make sure.
So the people that are starving aren't Christians, that's why they're starving?
We'd have to give a specific example.
I don't.
Do you know of somebody that is a member of the church? That's the question. Do you know of somebody who's a member of the church, a faithful member of the church, who died due to hunger? That's the question. I don't know of anybody like that. I mean, so all of it becomes theoretical, but when we're talking about the providence of God, okay, the question is whether we trust Jesus or not in Matthew 6. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Let's pull up Matthew 6 here again. So, whatever the specific incident is, the specific situation, the question is still going to come down to Matthew 6:25. For I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you're going to eat, or your body, what you'll put on. Is life not? Look at the birds of the air; they're not having to worry about it. Aren't you of more value? Which of you by worrying? Don't worry about your clothing. If God so clothes the fowl, He'll. Now remember, though, the qualification here is they have to be seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. And what I would say to you is, hardly anybody, even in the church, does that. I mean, come on, let's face it. Hardly anybody in the church really does this in their life. Put the church first. When it comes down to it, if somebody's going to lose their job, the church is going to come second. And Jesus says right here, okay, why would you worry about losing your job? Well, because you'd be worried about food and clothes. No, he said, don't do that. Put the church first. That's actually the context here. I hardly know any Christians who are willing to have that kind of, what did Jesus say? Faith. That's what it comes down to. Okay, so that's the people he's talking about. He's talking about if you have that kind of faith, you're going to be golden. You're going to be okay. He's going to make sure that you're provided for. All right, now, I mean, do we believe it or not? I believe it. I've never seen anything otherwise. I've seen a lot of people that are hungry and begging for food, and I know about their life, and I know they're not doing this. I see that a lot. You know, and I can't judge every person out there, but I can tell them what this passage says. That's all I can do. That's an important concept. We've got to make sure we have clear on it. It comes down to, do we believe Jesus or not on this? If he says that's true, there's got to be something wrong, I would say, in that person's life, logically. That's like somebody bringing up the scenario. How can it be that, let's say you're on this deserted island and you don't have a Bible, and so you die and you just couldn't be baptized. You didn't know anything about it. Okay, that scenario is not going to happen biblically, because look at what Jesus says. In fact, right here in the same context, look at Matthew 7. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened. Everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. Him who knocks. All right. So that means there is no scenario where a person that really wants to know the truth is not going to be able to find it. That scenario will not exist. God will make sure it does not happen. You have to believe this, though. I mean, we have to be able to willing to say that. I mean, is Jesus a liar? I mean, that's what we're really saying. Is Jesus a liar? If he's not a liar, then we know everybody that is really seeking is going to have an opportunity to find the truth. And that's where Christians can come in other ways. I've seen all kinds of really interesting ways that the providence of God will play a role in people finding the truth. And it's weird. Like I heard about one guy who a bottle washed up on the shore that had like a track in it. This is like down in like South America. And he looked on the track and contacted the local preacher and said, hey, this track came up and I want to get baptized. I mean, you just never know. I mean, God will make sure it happens. That's just God. I mean, we don't have to think in purely natural terms. There is a supernatural God, and he works in our life. So that scenario always bothers me. Oh, the deserted island. Well, it's just not going to happen. I mean, if the person genuinely is seeking, he's going to be able to find the truth. Now, he doesn't guarantee you 2 opportunities. Okay, so if you didn't take the first opportunity and then you died on the way to get baptized, there's another scenario. Right? I hear that one a lot. Okay, did you ever have an opportunity before that? Well, yeah, I did. Okay, God doesn't guarantee you 2. You better take the opportunity while you have it. He gave the people in Noah's day 120 years of opportunities, and then that was it. That was it. That's what they got. He doesn't guarantee us 120 years. It could be on the way home right now. Could be it. And nobody can fault God, because God is fair. He's just. He gives us opportunities. It's up to us to take them. And if we're not ready to take them, tough. That's on us. Like the kid that says, oh, I'm not hungry right now. I'm not going to eat my green beans. Well, Sorry, you might be hungry later. Okay? 'Cause that's what you're getting. The food's prepared right now. Your mama's fixing to throw it in the trash. Or your daddy's going to eat it. How about that? Okay, what has it been? An hour and a half or something? Probably better call it quits. Let's see. Yeah, I guess we'll call it quits. I'll hand it to you, David.
Well, hasn't this been such an educational and edifying time? And I think that was a good spot to leave off, because we're about to have our invitation song. And we just had a great exhortation to be fully committed to the Lord and His church. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. So, if you realize that you have not been seeking first His kingdom, and you would like to rectify that, if you realize that you have some sin in your life that you've been trying to hold on to, or that you need to take that step and get baptized, we want to be here for you, and we are here for you. So please let your need be known as Bob leads us in this invitation.